Pay attention to how many times you say sorry today. Not for things that genuinely warranted an apology. For the other kind. Sorry for needing a moment to think. Sorry for taking the last chair at the table. Sorry for being in someone's path in a hallway. Sorry for having an opinion. Sorry for asking a question. Sorry for taking up space in a conversation that was technically open to you. For some people, that list is short. The apologies are proportionate to actual offenses. They say sorry when sorry is appropriate, and the rest of the time they exist without pre-announcing their presence as an inconvenience. And for some people, the list runs from morning to night. An almost constant current of small social contractions, the making of oneself smaller before anyone has asked, the managing of the room before anyone has complained, the posture of, "I'm sorry for being here," delivered so consistently and in so many forms that it has stopped feeling like an apology and started feeling like just how they move through the world. And here's what's curious about that second kind of person. They're often not meek, not self-deprecating in any obvious sense. They can be warm, capable, even confident in certain domains. But there's something in how they occupy space, physical space, emotional space, relational space, that is always slightly contracted, always slightly pre-apologetic. As if they arrived somewhere long ago and were told, not in words but in every available other way, that they were a little too much. And they've been managing that ever since. Researcher Karina Schumann at the University of Pittsburgh has studied apologizing behavior with unusual precision. Specifically, what drives excessive apologizing in people who haven't done anything wrong. What her research shows is that over-apologizing is not primarily about guilt for an offense. It's a social regulation strategy. It preempts disapproval. It signals non-threat. It communicates, before anyone has raised a concern, that this person is already managing their own impact, already making themselves smaller so that no one else has to ask them to. This sorry isn't an apology. It's a preemptive act of self-reduction. And it works in a narrow sense. It manages social friction. It keeps people comfortable. It prevents the kind of conflict that, for someone with this history, feels genuinely threatening even in contexts where nothing is actually at risk. But here's what it costs. And here's where it starts. At some point, someone taught you that your needs were secondary, not with those words, but with the way they responded when you had them. And you adjusted, and kept adjusting, until one day, you weren't sure what you actually needed anymore. Unlearning that is possible. It's not fast, but it's possible. I've written about what that looks like. Link in the description and first pinned comment. John Bowlby's foundational work on attachment and the decades of research that followed documented something specific. Children whose presence, whose full, emotional, needing, wanting presence is consistently received as inconvenient by the people around them don't conclude that the environment is the problem. They're not yet cognitively equipped for that conclusion. What they conclude is more immediate and more personal. Too much of me creates difficulty for the people I need. That conclusion doesn't arrive as a thought. It arrives as a feeling, a physical, bodily sense that taking up full space in a room is risky. That needing things openly is risky. That having opinions, emotions, desires, preferences that are visibly one's own is somehow always slightly more than what's welcome. And the child adapts. They learn to pre-shrink. To arrive already edited. To move through relational space with a quality of advance apology built into the way they hold their shoulders, the way they introduce their opinions, the way they check the room before speaking. This isn't always the result of explicit messages. Sometimes it's a sigh, the particular kind that means not now. Sometimes it's a parent who is always busy, always managing something more urgent than what the child needed. Sometimes it's the way warmth was available freely when the child was undemanding and slightly withdrawn when they were not. None of this is dramatic. None of it requires intention or cruelty. It just requires repetition. And repetition, in the nervous system of a developing child, is education. Now, here is what the chronic apology does, not in the moment, but over time. Cognitive behavioral psychology, built substantially on the foundational work of Aaron Beck, established something that has since been replicated across thousands of clinical contexts. Core beliefs are maintained not just by the environment that created them, but by the behaviors the person develops in response to them. Every time someone with a core belief of "I am too much" pre-apologizes for their presence, the behavior confirms the belief. Not in any deliberate or conscious way, but because the nervous system, which is always learning, observes, "I apologized, and the discomfort was managed." The equation holds. Too much of me equals bad. Shrinking equals safe. And the belief gets stronger, even in rooms that have given no evidence for it. The apology is supposed to protect the person. Instead, it trains them further into the posture they're trying to escape. And there's something else, something you feel but can't always explain, about what this pattern does to the relationships around the chronic apologizer. It's not that people become cruel. It's that they calibrate. When someone consistently signals, "I'm sorry for being here," the people receiving that signal, usually without realizing they're doing it, begin to treat that person's presence as something to be accommodated rather than welcomed. They stop insisting on the person's opinion. They stop asking how they are with real expectation of an honest answer. The self-reduction has been offered so consistently that everyone around them has started to accept it as a fair description of what this person is worth, which is precisely and quietly the worst possible outcome. Because the person who apologizes for taking up space is not too much. They were at some point in an environment that had too little capacity for them. Those are not the same thing. But the difference between them, after years of apology, after years of contraction, after years of pre-shrinking, has become very difficult to feel from the inside. The belief and the reality have merged. The person has become, to themselves, what the original environment treated them as. And that merging of the original environment's limitations with the person's self-concept produces a very specific kind of confusion. When someone challenges the apology, when they say, "You don't have to apologize for that," or "You're allowed to be here," the person often doesn't experience relief. They experience a kind of mild cognitive disorientation, as if the statement doesn't quite fit the internal model they're operating from. Not because they disbelieve it intellectually, but because the felt sense of their own presence, the bodily experience of taking up space, has been calibrated so long to too much that the challenge reads as kind but inaccurate, like being told something nice that doesn't quite apply. That's how deep the merger has gone. And what makes it harder is that the apology often works in the narrow, immediate sense. The preemptive contraction does smooth social friction. It does prevent the disapproval it's anticipating, which means every successful apology is also a piece of evidence for the belief. The loop that was supposed to protect them becomes the mechanism that keeps them inside it. This is why telling someone to just stop apologizing doesn't work. The apology isn't a habit. It's a conclusion. And conclusions change only when the evidence that formed them accumulates differently, slowly, over time, through moments that don't require the contraction and survive it. But here's what almost nobody tells the person who lives inside this pattern. The apology is a loop, and loops can be interrupted. Not by deciding to stop apologizing. That's not how behavioral patterns work. Not by telling yourself you're not too much, which the part of you that still believes you are will simply reject. But by doing something smaller and more specific, by noticing in real time when the apology is about to arrive and pausing, just long enough to ask, "Is this actually mine to apologize for?" That pause is where the loop gets interrupted. Not broken, interrupted. And over time, interruption is what changes things. And what interrupting it actually feels like, in practice, is worth naming because it's not what most people who've carried this pattern for a long time expect. It doesn't feel like confidence. Not at first. The pause, the moment between the arriving apology and the question, "Is this actually mine?" produces something closer to disorientation than relief. A brief internal silence where the automatic response was supposed to go and didn't, and now there's a small, unfamiliar space where the apology would have been. That space is where the pattern loosens. Not dramatically, not permanently, but enough. Karina Schumann's research on apologizing behavior documents something that most people in this pattern can verify from the inside. The function of the apology is not primarily to manage other people. It's to manage the internal state of the person giving it. The anticipatory anxiety, the prediction that someone's disapproval is imminent, that taking up space is about to produce a cost, is genuinely uncomfortable. And the apology, by preemptively reducing the threat, provides real, immediate relief, which is why stopping doesn't work. The apology isn't performing for an audience, it's self-regulating. And interrupting a self-regulation behavior requires replacing it with something else, not simply removing it. The pause has to be filled with something: the question, the moment of consideration, the brief contact with the actual situation rather than the predicted one. Without that replacement, the interrupted apology just waits for the next available moment. What changes this isn't willpower. It's new evidence. And new evidence comes from staying in rooms long enough to discover that the apology wasn't actually needed. Before you go, I want you to hear something that maybe no one has said to you in a while. You don't have to earn your place in every room you walk into. You don't have to be useful to deserve to be there. I know that's easier to hear than it is to believe. That's exactly why I went much deeper into this, in what I've left linked below, in the description, and in the first pinned comment. Now I want to ask you something directly. Count roughly the apologies from today. The quick ones, the reflexive ones, the ones that came out before you'd consciously decided anything. Now ask, how many of those were for something that actually needed an apology? The gap between those two numbers is where the pattern lives. And then this, think about the last time you took up space, fully, without pre-editing, without checking the room first. Not aggressively. Just as much space as was actually yours, with as much presence as you actually had, without contracting in advance. For some people, that memory is recent. For others, it requires reaching back further than it should. And for some people, the honest answer is, I'm not sure I know what that feels like. I'm not sure I've ever been in a room without some part of me already managing how much of me is there. That's the answer worth sitting with. Because you were not put on this earth to be smaller than you are. The apology was a response to a specific context, one that genuinely couldn't hold your full presence, for reasons that had nothing to do with your worth. But that context isn't every context. And the people in your life right now, the ones who have stayed, who have chosen you, who keep showing up, they haven't been doing that for the reduced version. They've been doing it for whatever it is of you that still gets through. Imagine what they'd get to receive if all of it showed up. If something in this video found you today, leave a comment. Tell me one thing you've apologized for this week that needed no apology at all. I read every one. And subscribe if you haven't, because what comes next goes even deeper into where this contraction starts and what it looks like when someone finally gives themselves permission to stop. That one is worth waiting for.